Story 1. As the moon hung heavy in the night sky, casting eerie shadows across the desolate parking lot of the abandoned hospital, a sense of dread settled upon the group of daring adventurers. They had come seeking thrills, fueled by the allure of a haunted tale that had been passed down through generations. The hospital, a decaying relic of a bygone era, stood ominously before them. Its windows were shattered, its walls were covered in ivy, and its once white exterior had turned a sickly shade of gray. It was as if the building itself had succumbed to the malevolent energy that surrounded it. With trembling excitement, the group pushed open the creaking doors and entered the hospital's dimly lit foyer. The air was heavy with the musty scent of old books and decay. The echoes of their footsteps reverberated through the empty halls, a haunting symphony that seemed to beckon them deeper into the building. As they ventured further into the hospital's labyrinthine corridors, they began to hear faint whispers, like the distant murmurings of lost souls. Each member of the group felt a chill creep down their spine, but they pressed on, their curiosity overcoming their fear. Suddenly, a flicker of movement caught their attention. They turned to see a spectral figure in a nurse's uniform, her eyes empty sockets of darkness, and her expression twisted into a grotesque eternal grimace. She moved toward them with a ghostly grace, her footsteps making no sound. Panic seized the group, and they stumbled backward, their heartbeats echoing loudly in their ears. The spectral nurse continued to advance, her spectral form seeming to elongate and distort with each step. Desperate to escape the ghostly apparition, the group split up, racing down different corridors in a frantic bid to evade the nurse's relentless pursuit. But no matter which way they turned, she was always there, lurking in the shadows, her malevolent presence growing stronger with each passing moment. One by one, the members of the group were overcome by a suffocating sense of dread, their minds unraveling as the nurse's whispers wormed their way into their consciousness. They began to see nightmarish visions of the hospital's grim past, filled with pain, suffering, and despair. As dawn broke on the horizon, only one member of the group remained, their sanity barely intact. The spectral nurse, her form growing more grotesque and monstrous by the minute, cornered the lone survivor in a dimly lit room. With trembling hands, the survivor pulled out an old, dusty journal they had found earlier in the hospital. It contained the harrowing account of a nurse who had committed unspeakable acts within these very walls. With a last, desperate plea, the survivor read aloud from the journal, hoping to release the nurse's tormented soul from its eternal torment. As the words filled the air, a blinding light enveloped the nurse, and her horrific visage contorted in agony. The whispers ceased, and the hospital grew still. The malevolent energy that had clung to the building dissipated, leaving behind an empty, lifeless shell. The survivor, exhausted and traumatized, stumbled out of the hospital, the morning sun now shining brightly. They knew they would carry the scars of that night forever, but they also knew that the spectral nurse would haunt them no more. And so, the tale of the ghostly abandoned hospital and its malevolent nurse passed into legend, a cautionary tale for those who dared to tread where the living and the dead converged. The whispers of the undead no longer echoed through the empty halls, but the memory of that night would forever haunt the survivors, a reminder that some horrors were best left undisturbed. Story 2. The hiker, a young man named David, had been hiking in the woods for hours. He was starting to get tired and hungry, and he was about to turn back when he saw something in the distance. It was a small cabin, hidden away in the trees. David was curious, so he decided to investigate. He walked up to the cabin and knocked on the door. There was no answer. He knocked again, louder this time. Still no answer. David tried the doorknob and it turned. The door was unlocked. He slowly pushed the door open and stepped inside. The cabin was dark and dusty. There was no furniture, and the only light came from a small window. David could hear the sound of his own breathing as he stood there, taking in his surroundings. Suddenly, he heard a noise. It was a low, guttural growl. David spun around, his heart pounding in his chest. There, standing in the doorway, was a man. He was tall and thin, with long, greasy hair and a beard. His eyes were wild and bloodshot. "Who are you?" David asked, his voice trembling. The man didn't answer. He just stared at David with those cold, empty eyes. "What do you want?" David asked. The man took a step towards him. "I want you," he said. David turned and ran. He didn't know where he was going, but he had to get away. The man chased after him, his laughter echoing through the woods. David could hear him getting closer, and he knew he couldn't outrun him. He had to find a place to hide. He saw a tree up ahead, and he ran towards it. He ducked behind the tree. Just as the man came around the corner, the man stopped and looked around. He didn't see David, so he started to walk away. David waited until the man was gone, and then he came out from behind the tree. He didn't know what to do. He was lost and alone, and he was being hunted by a deranged killer. He started to walk, hoping to find his way back to the trail. But the woods were thick and confusing, and he soon realized he was only getting more lost. He was starting to panic. He didn't know what to do. He was all alone, and he was going to die. Suddenly, he heard a noise. It was the same noise he had heard before, the low, guttural growl. He turned around, and there was the man. He was standing right in front of him. David closed his eyes and waited for the end. But the end never came. When he opened his eyes, the man was gone. David didn't know what to think. He had been so sure he was going to die, but somehow he had survived. He didn't know how, but he knew he had to get out of the woods. He started to walk, and this time he didn't stop. He walked for hours, until he finally came to the edge of the woods. He collapsed on the ground, exhausted and relieved. He had made it. He had survived. He never went back into the woods again, but he never forgot what happened there. The memory of the deranged killer haunted him for the rest of his life. Story 3. The young girl named Sarah had always been fascinated by dolls. She had a collection of them, all different sizes and shapes. But her favorite doll was a small, antique doll that she had found in a thrift store. The doll was made of porcelain and had long, flowing hair. Its eyes were blue, and its smile was innocent. Sarah named the doll Emily. At first, Sarah loved Emily. She would take her everywhere with her. But then, strange things started to happen. One day, Sarah was playing with Emily when she heard a voice. The voice was coming from the doll. "Help me," the voice said. Sarah was startled. She didn't know what to do. "Who's there?" she asked. "It's me, Emily," the voice said. "I'm trapped." Sarah didn't know what to believe. She put Emily down and went to get her parents. When she came back, Emily was gone. Sarah searched everywhere for her, but she couldn't find her. That night, Sarah had a dream. In the dream, she was back in the thrift store where she had found Emily. She saw the doll sitting on a shelf. But this time, Emily's eyes were black and her smile was cruel. "I'm gonna get you," the doll said. Sarah woke up in a cold sweat. She knew that the doll was real and that it was evil. The next day, Sarah started to see Emily everywhere. She would see her in the corner of her room, or in the mirror. Sometimes she would even hear her voice. Sarah was starting to lose her mind. She didn't know what to do. She was afraid to tell her parents because they wouldn't believe her. One day, Sarah couldn't take it anymore. She ran away from home. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she had to get away from Emily. Sarah wandered the streets for hours. She was exhausted and scared. She didn't know what to do. Finally, she came to a park. She sat down on a bench and started to cry. "Why is this happening to me?" she asked. Suddenly, she felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned around and saw Emily. "I've been waiting for you," the doll said. Sarah screamed and ran away. She ran as fast as she could. She didn't stop until she was sure that Emily wasn't following her. Sarah never saw Emily again, but she knew that the doll was still out there, waiting for her. Sarah never forgot what happened to her. She learned that there are evil things in the world, and that sometimes they come in the form of a small, innocent-looking doll. Story 4. A young programmer named Mark had been addicted to the virtual reality game for weeks. He would spend hours every day playing, ignoring his job and his friends. The game was called The Void, and it was unlike anything Mark had ever experienced before. It was a fully immersive experience where he could feel, smell, and even taste the world around him. At first, Mark was fascinated by the game. He loved exploring the different worlds and meeting the strange creatures that inhabited them. But as time went on, he started to feel trapped. He couldn't seem to break away from the game, no matter how hard he tried. One day, Mark decided to try to quit the game. He took off the headset and went for a walk outside. But even though he was in the real world, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was still in the game. He saw the trees and the flowers, but they all looked fake. He heard the birds singing, but their songs sounded like they were coming from a recording. Mark started to panic. He didn't know what was real anymore. He felt like he was going crazy. He ran back to his apartment and put on the headset. Again, he needed to escape from the real world, even if it meant staying in the game. But when Mark put on the headset, he didn't go back to the world he had been playing in before. He was in a new world, a world that was even more terrifying than the last. The world was dark and empty. There were no trees or flowers, no birds or animals. There was nothing but darkness and silence. Mark wandered through the world, lost and alone. He didn't know where he was or how to get out. He was starting to lose hope. He thought he was going to be trapped in the game forever. But then, Mark saw something in the distance. It was a light, a small glimmer of hope. Mark ran towards the light, and as he got closer, he saw that it was coming from a door. Mark reached the door and opened it. He stepped through and he was back in the real world. Mark was relieved to be back in the real world, but he knew that he would never forget the horror of the virtual world. He had learned a valuable lesson. Not everything is what it seems. Mark never went back to the virtual reality game. He knew that it was too dangerous. He had almost lost himself in the game, and he didn't want to risk it happening again. Mark's story is a cautionary tale about the dangers of virtual reality. It is important to remember that virtual reality is not real, and that it can be addictive. If you are considering playing a virtual reality game, be sure to do your research and to set limits on your playtime. Story 5. A young couple with 2 young children had been looking for the perfect home for a long time. They had finally found it in a seemingly idyllic suburban neighborhood. The houses were all well maintained. The lawns were neatly trimmed, and the children played in the streets without a care in the world. The family quickly settled in and started to make friends with their neighbors. Everyone seemed so friendly and welcoming, but the family soon began to notice some strange things. For one thing, the neighbors were always very careful not to let their children out of their sight, and they always seemed to be watching the family from behind their curtains. The family also started to hear strange noises at night. They sounded like someone was crying or screaming, but they could never find the source of the noise. One day, the family's young son went missing. They searched everywhere for him, but they couldn't find him. The police were called, but they were unable to find any trace of the boy. The family was devastated. They didn't know what to do or who to trust. They started to wonder if the neighbors had something to do with their son's disappearance. The family eventually moved away from the neighborhood, but they never forgot what happened there. They knew that there was something dark and sinister lurking behind the closed doors of those seemingly perfect homes. The family story is a cautionary tale about the dangers of appearances. Not everything is what it seems, and even the most idyllic neighborhoods can hide dark secrets. If you are ever in a situation where you feel like something is wrong, trust your gut instinct. Don't be afraid to speak up, even if it means making waves. Your safety is more important than anything else. Story 6. The team of divers, led by a man named Captain Jones, had been exploring the depths of the ocean for hours. They had seen some amazing things, but nothing like this. The underwater tomb was massive, and it was clear that it had been built centuries ago. The walls were covered in intricate carvings, and the floor was littered with bones. Captain Jones knew that they had found something special. He ordered his team to stay close and to be careful. The divers slowly made their way through the tomb, careful not to disturb anything. They could feel the weight of history all around them. Suddenly, they heard a noise. It was a low, guttural growl. The divers turned around, and they saw something that made their blood run cold. Standing in the doorway of the tomb was a creature. It was tall and thin, with long, sharp teeth and claws. Its eyes were red, and they burned with hatred. The creature roared, and the divers turned and ran. They didn't stop running until they were back on the surface. They told Captain Jones what they had seen, but he didn't believe them. He thought they were just imagining things, but the divers knew what they had seen. They knew that the creature was real and that it was dangerous. They never went back to the underwater tomb, but they never forgot what they had seen there. The creature's story is a cautionary tale about the dangers of disturbing the resting place of the dead. It is a reminder that there are things in this world that we do not understand, and that it is best to leave them alone. The creature is still out there, somewhere in the depths of the ocean. It is waiting for its next victim. Story 7. The Twisted Circus came to town, promising fun and laughter. But, as the audience soon discovered, the performers were not as human as they appeared. The first clue was the smell. It was a strange, sickly sweet smell that filled the air around the circus tent. The second clue was the way the performers looked. They were all tall and thin, with pale skin and dark eyes. Their smiles were too wide, and their eyes were too bright. The audience tried to ignore their misgivings and enjoy the show. But it was hard to focus on the clowns and acrobats when they kept glancing at the performers. The show ended, and the audience filed out of the tent. But as they were leaving, they saw something that made their blood run cold. The performers were not human. They were monsters. The clowns had sharp teeth and claws, and the acrobats long, spindly limbs. They all had red eyes that burned with hatred. The audience screamed and ran, But the monsters were faster. They chased the audience through the streets, laughing and howling. Some of the audience members escaped, but others were not so lucky. They were caught by the monsters and taken back to the circus tent. The monsters locked the audience members in cages and began to torture them. They cut them with their claws, burned them with their fire breath, and drank their blood. The audience members screamed and begged for mercy. But the monsters did not care. They were enjoying their suffering. One by one, the audience members died, but their screams did not stop. The monsters kept them alive for as long as possible, so they could enjoy their pain. Finally, there was only one person left, a young woman named Sarah. She was the only one who had managed to escape the monsters' clutches. Sarah knew she had to find a way to stop the monsters. She couldn't let them hurt anyone else. She snuck back to the circus tent and found the monster's lair. It was a dark and twisted place, full of blood and gore. Sarah found the monster's leader, a creature called the Ringmaster. He was a tall and thin man with a long white beard. His eyes were red and they burned with madness. Sarah knew that she had to defeat the Ringmaster. In order to stop the monsters, she drew her sword and charged at him. The Ringmaster laughed and met her attack with his own sword. They fought for hours, neither one of them able to gain an advantage. Finally, Sarah managed to land a blow that struck the Ringmaster's heart. He fell to the ground, dead. The monsters were defeated. Sarah had saved the day, but she knew that the monsters would not be gone forever. They would be back, and next time they would be even stronger. Sarah vowed to be ready for them when they returned. She would train and prepare, and she would not let them hurt anyone else. Sarah's story is a reminder that there are evil forces in the world, but it is also a reminder that good can always triumph over evil. Story 8. The desolate mansion stood on a hill, surrounded by dark woods. The windows were all boarded up, and the paint was peeling. It looked like no one had lived there in years. But there was one person who did live there, a young woman named Sarah. She had inherited the mansion from her grandmother, who had died under mysterious circumstances. Sarah had never been to the mansion before, but she had heard stories about it. Stories about the Black Mirror. The Black Mirror was said to be magical. It could grant any wish. But there was a catch. The wish would come with a terrifying price. Sarah didn't believe the stories. She thought they were just superstition, but she was curious about the Black Mirror. She wanted to see if it was real. One night, Sarah went to the attic of the mansion. That's where the Black Mirror was said to be hidden. She found the mirror in a dusty corner. It was covered in cobwebs, and it looked like it hadn't been used in years. Sarah wiped the mirror clean and looked into it. She saw her own reflection, but it was different. It was darker, and there was something sinister about it. Sarah reached out and touched the mirror. As soon as she did, she felt a surge of power. She knew that the mirror was real. Sarah thought about her deepest desire. She wished to be rich and powerful. She wished to have everything she ever wanted. She closed her eyes and made her wish. When she opened her eyes, she saw that her wish had come true. She was rich and powerful, and she had everything she ever wanted. But there was a price to pay. Sarah was now trapped in the mansion. She couldn't leave, and she couldn't escape the Black Mirror. The mirror was always watching her, and it was always tempting her. It wanted her to make more wishes. Even though she knew that the price would be too high. Sarah tried to resist the temptation, but it was no use. She made more and more wishes, and each one came with a higher price. Eventually, Sarah was so corrupted by the mirror that she lost her humanity. She became a monster, just like the mirror. The Black Mirror is still there, in the desolate mansion. It's waiting for its next victim. Be careful what you wish for. Story 9. The group of friends, 5 in total, gathered around the campfire, sharing spine, chilling tales of the supernatural. They were all avid fans of horror stories and movies, and they loved to scare each other. The stories they told were all different, but they all had one thing in common. They were all about the dark forces that lurked in the shadows. Friends laughed and joked as they told their stories, but there was a sense of unease in the air. They all knew that the stories they were telling were not just fiction. There was something real about them, something that made them feel afraid. As the night went on, the stories became darker and more disturbing. The friends started to talk about things like demons, ghosts, and possession. They talked about the things that go bump in the night and the things that could happen to you if you weren't careful. The friends were all starting to feel scared, but they didn't want to stop telling stories. They were too afraid of what might happen if they did. The last story of the night was told by the youngest member of the group, a girl named Sarah. Her story was about a haunted house that she had visited with her family. Sarah told the story in a trembling voice, and her eyes were wide with fear. She told about the strange noises she had heard, the cold spots she had felt, and the feeling that she was being watched. When Sarah was finished, the friends were all silent. They were all too scared to say anything. They sat around the campfire for a few more minutes, but they didn't tell any more stories. They were all too afraid. Finally, one of the friends got up and said, "I think it's time to go to bed." The others agreed, and they all started to pack up their things. As they were leaving, they all looked back at the campfire. It was still burning, but it looked different somehow. It looked like it was alive. The friends shivered and hurried away. They didn't look back. They didn't sleep well that night. They all had nightmares about the things they had talked about around the campfire. The next morning, they woke up feeling tired and shaken. They didn't want to talk about what had happened, but they knew that they would never forget it. The friends never went back to that campfire, and they never told anyone else about the stories they had told that night. But they all knew that the stories were real, and that something dark and evil had been lurking in the shadows. Story 10. The haunted hotel stood on a hill, overlooking the town. It had been abandoned for years, but it was said to be haunted by the ghosts of its former guests. One night, a group of friends decided to stay in the hotel. They thought it would be a fun adventure, but they soon realized that this was no ordinary lodging. Shadows lurked in every corner, and the air was filled with the sound of whispers. The friends started to feel uneasy, but they didn't want to leave. They were too afraid of what might happen if they did. That night, the friends were awakened by strange noises. They heard footsteps in the hallway and the sound of laughter coming from the attic. They got out of bed and went to investigate. They found the hallway empty, but the attic door was open. The friends slowly made their way up the stairs. The attic was dark and dusty, and the only light came from a single window. Friends looked around and saw that the attic was filled with old furniture and boxes. There was also a large mirror in the corner. The friends started to feel cold, and they could hear the sound of their own breathing. They knew that they should leave, but they couldn't seem to move. Suddenly, the mirror started to fog up. The friends watched in horror as a face appeared in the mirror. It was the face of a young woman, and she was screaming. The friends screamed and ran out of the attic. They didn't stop running until they were back in their rooms. The friends didn't sleep that night. They lay in bed, listening to the sounds of the hotel. They knew that the ghosts were still there, and they were waiting for them. The next morning, the friends packed their bags and left the hotel. They never went back, and they never spoke of what they had seen. But they never forgot the haunted hotel and the ghosts that lurked within its walls.